Christians throughout the ages have read this text in sometimes in places. For example, during the Middle Ages, the Roman Church interpreted the two swords to mean that Christ had entrusted to Peter, the first pope, the coercive power over both the church and the state. Look, he's given the Pope two swords. Which, if you ask me, is a rather creative and self-serving way of interpreting this passage. Look it up, the two swords doctrine, the Galatian theory. Anyway. We can also read Jesus' words as a rebuke. That's enough. Any parent, I guarantee you, is familiar with those two words. Hey, that's enough. Knock it off. When the kids aren't being obedient, when they're not really listening, paying attention to what you're telling them. And if you know anything about the Gospels, they had a listening problem, right? Jesus would say something, and they would hear it in an entirely different way because their minds were worldly. They often missed the spiritual essence of what Jesus was driving at. I think the meaning behind Jesus' words becomes clearer as we continue reading. Later that evening, you remember, Jesus takes the disciples with him to the Garden of Gethsemane. He's going to go off and pray. And he urges them to stay put and to pray lest they fall into temptation. So Jesus goes away about a stone's throw, and he throws himself down on the ground before the Father, and he prays like his life depends on it. Right? He prays so much that the sweat from his brow hits the ground like drops of blood. Hey, Shankwith, you need to sit down. We're worshiping God right now. Okay, go do that. Have you ever prayed that hard? Where you sweated so hard that it was like you were bleeding? Jesus did. When he gets back to the disciples, what does he find? Yeah, he finds the disciples asleep, right? They're not praying. And here I think is the irony we see. They're armed, they're ready to rumble, they're ready to shed blood for Jesus, and yet they're not willing and ready to pray. They're not spiritually armed for the battle ahead of them. Well, you remember what happens next. Jesus' betrayer, Judas, comes leading an armed mob with clubs and swords. And when the disciples see what's going on, they spring into action. Lord, should we strike with our swords? And before Jesus can answer, one of them draws his sword and lops off the ear of the high priest's servant. Now we know from John's gospel that the sword-wielding disciple was Simon Peter. And the name of the high priest's servant was Evander Holyfield. Malchus, actually. If you don't know about Evander Holyfield and his ear, YouTube it. Mike Tyson versus Evander Holyfield. Thank me later. So this time, I think Jesus' rebuke is pretty clear, right? He answers, no more of this. And then he touches the man's ear and heals him. This is the last miracle that Jesus performs before his death. He heals the severed ear of an enemy. And in so doing, maybe he opens our ears as well. The kingdom of God will not come at the point of a sword. It's not something that will advance come about through violent actions on our part. This business of whipping up your followers into a frenzy and getting them to incite violence, that's the stuff that despots and demagogues do. That's not who Jesus is. Jesus is a different kind of leader. Jesus is a different kind of king. It's like he told Pontius Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place. Jesus told his disciples to put their swords away because his kingdom's of a different kind. Jesus didn't come to raise up an army, but to lay down his life. Mahatma Gandhi once said, everyone in the world knows that Jesus and his teachings were nonviolent except Christians. Ouch. How is it that so many Christians over the ages have tortured and killed their fellow man in the name of Christ? In the name of Christ. Maybe because deep down there is a part of us that's a lot like the Israelites of Samuel's time or the Jews of Jesus' time. Deep down, we really want a king like all the other nations. We want our strong man to do our bidding, who'll hate the people we hate, who'll support the causes we support. We'll fight the battles we think are worth fighting, and who'll deliver the victory on our terms. With the Messiah as our mascot, we can march boldly into the fray, just as confident of our enemy's utter wickedness as we are in our own righteousness. His truth is marching on. That's not the way of Jesus. His kingdom is not of this world, and neither are the weapons with which we fight. Yes, we need to take up arms for the kingdom, but not in the way the disciples thought. As the Apostle Paul points out, though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. Christians, remember that. Not just what's going on in Russia, but what's going on here in this country, the tensions we find around us, and not just people fighting with their fists or whatever, but though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. Don't fight the world's battles. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Christians, what's our battlefield? It's here, right? Taking captive every thought to make it obedient to Jesus Christ. We're in a battle for the minds and hearts of souls of people deceived by the evil one. And he's going to try to bait us into fighting his war on his terms. He tried it with Jesus. The evil one's the real enemy. Our battle requires a different kind of strategy, a different kind of armor, and a different kind of weaponry. In Ephesians 6, Paul describes the various pieces that make up the armor of God. You've heard Sunday school's lessons about this galore, right? Get the breastplate of, or the belt of truth. Let's start there. Because if you don't have truth, you don't get anything, right? Got to hold up your britches somehow. Truth binds it all together. The belt of truth. And the breastplate of righteousness, which I take to be the righteousness of Christ, shielding us, protecting our hearts. And then we got our feet shod with the gospel of peace. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news, who declare our God reigns, the Lord reigns. And then you got the helmet of salvation and the shield of faith to fight off the